Hello and welcome to Amrita by the Book. My name is Amrita. This is my booktube, and today I am beyond excited to share with you one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year, and that would be A Master of Djinn by Djéli Clark. So a bit of background, I first came across Clark last year, which is when I began to really get into fantasy novellas, which is an art form that I have really come to appreciate. Like, I really enjoy reading fantasy authors experimenting with the form, because I feel like each of them does such interesting things with world building. And Clark in particular was really great with his novella called The Black God's Drums, which is set in an alt history version of New Orleans where the Civil War has ended, but it's sort of ended in a detente of sorts and there's no clear winner. Also in this particular world, Haiti has discovered or tapped into some kind of magical African power, and they have used it to throw back the French. So there's all this global stuff that's happening, as well as these things that are happening in New Orleans as the North and the South of the United States are jockeying for position. So it's sort of like the Cold War, but in the United States and in the 19th century, in this very steampunk setting. And at that time, I remember reading it and being blown away by not just the world building, but also the characters that he was able to introduce. Just genuinely great female characters who were awesome and who had an arc, and I couldn't wait to read more about these characters in later books. And I don't know if that's something that he's working on, if that's coming out soon, but also at the time I was trying to find more things by him, and I came across this short story that he had published on the tour website called A Dead Djinn in Cairo, and I immediately liked it. Like, it had a really great setting and it was something that I hadn't read before, and I remember thinking, oh, this is great. And then I discovered that he had actually written a couple of other novellas that are set in that same universe. When I heard that he was coming out with a full-length novel, I was delighted to find out that it featured the inspector from that very first short story, and her name is Fatima, and I adore her. So when I saw A Master of Djinn on NetGalley, I immediately sent in a request because I knew that I wanted to read this book. And my thanks to both NetGalley and Tor Books for approving my request. So this is an advanced reader copy review, but my opinions are my own. So in this world, basically in the 19th century in Egypt, there was a messiah figure, a prophet figure, and he opened this portal into another world, and that allowed magic to come flooding into our world. And some countries were resistant to it, other countries embraced it. Egypt was a country that embraced it, and now it has like this giant magical population. Old magic is waking up. There are a lot of things that are happening that I don't think everyone in this world has absolutely understood. Like, for instance, there's this talk of the old Egyptian gods and how they are slowly waking up and coming to life. And it's a really interesting dynamic because you have the common population of Egypt who are Muslim, and then you have these magical creatures, and that could be everything from like jinns to angels to ghouls to all sorts of things. And then you have these older magics and these older gods. There's this throwaway line about the ancient gods that have awoken in India, for instance, and helped the Indians throw out the British from India. And that is something that has happened in Egypt as well, So Egypt in actual history was part of the British Empire, and in this particular version they have thrown out the British or have greatly minimized their control over Egypt. And you have this sense of a society in flux as people are literally coming to understand and learn how to deal with a world in which fantasy is real. And that's always a dynamic that I enjoy, like I like the books in which magic is suddenly real and people are just like, wait, how do we deal with this? Like that's a topic that really engages my interest. But the thing that I really enjoy about Clarke is that he writes with such ambition. So he could have just written a novel about people dealing with the fallout from all this magic awakening, but he uses that to propel about 3 different narratives in this one book, and each of them is done so well. So on the one hand, you have all this magical stuff, right? So you have the magical beings and the humans with whom they have formed these strong connections, and they're each working for their own purposes and they have their own aims in mind, which are not always visible to the humans that they are in contact with. Then you have the British, who are dealing with the fallout of, like old wives' tales and mythology and fantasy coming to life, and also irreparably changing their understanding of the world and their position in it. So the British have just gone from being, and not just the British, it's really Europeans in general, have gone from being these burgeoning colonial powers to people who are also trying to understand how things have just changed so much, like this is the age of reason, this is the 19th century, everything's about industrialization, it's about setting aside all old superstitions. And then we come to 1912, which is when the story opens, and they're on the brink of the Great War, except in this particular timeline, they are on the brink of the World War because they are still struggling to understand and accept what happened with the introduction of magic into the world. So that is fundamentally a different world war than the one that happened in, our real timeline. And in the midst of all this, you have the women who are at the center of the story. So you have this inspector called Fatima al-Sharawi, and she is a paranormal investigator, I suppose. Like, she works for the Ministry of Magic. And the moment you meet her, she is immediately awesome. She's like very sharply dressed. She likes to wear pinstripe suits. And she's very anglicized, and yet she's very Egyptian. And she comes from a very Egyptian, rural, conservative background, but now she's in the big city and she has discovered an identity for herself. And it's fascinating to see herself, her interior thoughts and reactions and her determination to make something of herself that is fundamentally different from everything and everyone that she knows in her family. And you get to know this world through her eyes, and her eyes are not naive the way that it can be in so many of these stories, that you have the newcomer who's a novice and they're all like wide-eyed and trusting and dazzled by what they're seeing. And that's not Fatima at all. She's got this very like noir feel to her. Like, she's not jaded, but she's also not a trusting dummy. There's also the fact that Egypt at this time and Cairo, even though it's this very progressive, glitzy town, it's also still kind of conservative when it comes to women. And then all of a sudden, there's this woman in a pantsuit who is taking out jinns, and nobody really knows what to make of her. There is, however, one person who knows what to make of her, and that's Siti, who is a priestess for, like an old Egyptian goddess. And Siti has her own objectives. She is working for her own aims and ambitions. And whenever it intersects with Fatima and her investigations, they sort of come together and work. But they're also incredibly attracted to each other. And they're a couple, but they're a couple in this really weird way that is fascinating to watch unfold. Like, Fatima finds her beautiful and fascinating, but she's also a little bit scared of her, and that's probably wise. And in this particular novel, Fatima gets an assistant who is Hadia, who is actually that naive, big-eyed novice new to the city. But then as you go deeper into the story and you get to know her better, she actually transforms, and she has all these hidden depths that are fascinating and so enjoyable. Like, she suddenly transforms into this ninja at one point where you're just like, wait, what? And Fatima is just like, what? How did you do that? And Hadia is like, yeah, you think I just like rolled into your office and was like, hey, I'd like to be a detective? I've been in training. I know how to fight. And they develop this dynamic that is so interesting to watch, and I think it's so familiar to any woman out there who has an intergenerational friendship, because you have Fatima, who's not that much older than Hadia actually, but she was the first female detective that was hired by the Ministry of Magic, and she has a reputation now, and she doesn't want to be seen as the female detective, like that's how she is treated a great deal of the time, and she doesn't want to be that way. Like, she just wants to be taken on her own merits. And then you have Hadia, who is a committed feminist. She is a member of feminist organizations. She goes out and protests. She is really all about female sisterhood, and she kind of freaks Fatima out a little bit by just how militant she is about her feminism. And Fatima is always like, listen, lady, like, I get it, like, you're really into this stuff, but you don't need to put me in there as well. And Hadia gets super mad about it. She's just like, listen, men treat me in a certain way because I'm a woman in a hijab in a country where men are still kind of conservative about women. But you, a woman who has accomplished so much, if you can't be bothered to mentor me just because you don't want to be like the female detective with a female sidekick, and you think that's way too much female, then what hope do we have as a gender to advance? I really enjoy the scenes where Hadia is calling Fatima out because it's respectful, but points are made. And that same line of gender is what goes on to the central conflict in the story, which is actually a murder mystery. So yes, there is politics, there is feminism, there is fantasy, there is magic, and there's also a murder mystery. I told you Clark is way ambitious, and he actually pulls it off, as I'm going to say in a bit. But basically what happened was that in the opening pages of the book, you see that there is this Englishman who is he's a titled aristocrat, but he is a trope that is very common and familiar to people who have read a lot of 19th century literature, in that he is this white man with money who goes to the East to discover its secrets. And he ends up creating this secret society. And actually, like, theosophical societies were pretty common across the British Empire. I don't know if they were common in, like, the French and the German and the other colonies, but they were definitely very much a feature of the British Empire. And even within that organization, you see how gender plays a role. And so basically they all get murdered, and Fatima needs to find out like what prompted that murder, and that forms the bulk of the story and forms the catalyst for all these other stories to come together. And it is super interesting to see the resolution of that. I'm not going to give you any spoilers about like who done it and why, but I will say that it does make excellent points about gender and class. And I knew who the murderer was like pretty much in the first quarter, I would say, but that's because I watch a lot of murder. Maybe you'd figure it out, maybe you won't, I don't know. But I will say that even though I knew who did it, it didn't really impact my enjoyment of the story as a whole, or the resolution at the end, because sometimes, you know, like you can know who did it or not, but the resolution sometimes just fails you because it just doesn't tie everything together, like it's not satisfactory. But in this case, I thought it was super satisfactory. It really explained everything. There were real stakes involved, and it was a really great reveal. Now, I began this review by telling you that there are a bunch of novellas that precede this novel, and one of the things that comes up quite frequently when I mention this novel is whether you should read those novellas first. And I'm gonna say not really, like you can read this completely blind and you would be fine, but I am going to link down below to the first book or the first novella in the series, which is, you know, available for free on the Tor website, but you can also buy it as a novella on Kindle if you want to. Just check out the short story that I've linked below, and if you don't like the short story, then probably you might not like this particular book. It might not be for you, which is fine. But if you read the short story and you love it, then definitely get this book, because it is fantastic. One of my top reads for the first half of this year. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.